Hi, and welcome to the first of 3 modules for conflict resolution skills training for Sierra Club Colorado chapter. This was a in-person live training hosted also via webinar by CDR Associates on July 13th, 2019. So we've turned the 4-hour training into 3 shorter modules. This first module will discuss sources of conflict, strategic approaches to conflict, and we'll touch on one of the simulations that CDR did. The trainers who you will hear the most are Tabor Ward and Emily's Mack. We look forward to you participating in all 3 modules.
All right. So we're on slide 4, and if you're following along, I'll let you know when we're switching slides. Perfect. Has anyone seen this before? The conflict circle? That's convenient for me. And a lot of you were touching on this as we were discussing what you want to learn and why you need skills. So the conflict circle, we also sometimes call it the wheel of despair, touches on where conflict comes from. What are the sources? And in our field, there are 5 primary sources. There are the political realities, there are relationship problems, there are data challenges, there are organizational or structural constraints, and then there are value differences. So political realities are the limitations or the sources that are coming from the political sphere. This can be political inside an organization or political in the country. These are trends. Sometimes these are people's pet projects. Sometimes these are just the election cycles. One thing we heard in the survey was that there are challenges between lobbyists and members over the pace of the legislation. Some members want real activism, real radical stances, and some people are like, well, the politics just don't move at that pace. Relationship problems are often communication styles, communication structures. These come from personalities and are often tied to past baggage. When we were, again, looking at your survey responses, and thank you for filling that out, we saw a lot of concern over relationships with members, over not feeling comfortable with expressing opinions or not feeling comfortable with expressing disagreement. We heard sometimes people are just difficult. Sometimes they offend you, or sometimes they refuse to listen. And we heard that sometimes there are even personal attacks where you feel like, and Fran, did you touch on this? Where there's it's less professional. With data challenges, this is a funny one because sometimes you just have too much data. There's so much information, you don't even know where to begin. And sometimes you have too little information. You can't make an informed decision because there are big gaps. Some of this might also come into your comment about bees, where you just have different interpretations about what the problem is. You're looking at climate change from this huge global perspective, and someone else is looking at it from, well, how can we protect pollinators? Jonathan, who works at our organization, has a saying that he really likes, which is, for every PhD, there's an equal and differing PhD. And that goes back to this sense of conflict. Sometimes the information is just opposite. And so how do you work within that? The next one is structural constraints, and this ties into policies. This ties into decision-making and the resources that an organization has. We've heard someone had said that, I believe, Angela, was it you or Betty Jo, that the policies say this, and this is how it ought to be done? Angela. And so that is an organizational constraint. And then finally, there are value differences, and these are the trickiest ones. You're not going to change someone's values. We've heard a lot about this. So sometimes these are what are most important to people. Sometimes these are organizational missions. The mission of Sierra Club is not going to change. Sometimes this is operational preferences. Maybe you have a strong preference for working task-oriented or working relationship-oriented. Those are values. So we heard a lot about respecting different opinions without feeling like you have to change your position. We heard a lot about single issue mindsets. What do you do? And I don't want to pick on the bees, but when you're really passionate about this and someone only wants to talk about the bees, how do you work them through that very important value to them? So we're going to move to slide 5. Before, any questions about the wheel of despair or the conflict circle? Are you beginning to see how you can identify these in conflicts you're experiencing? Thank you. All right, so slide 5, this is where we begin to get into strategies. This is where we start to look at what can you do to alleviate the conflicts that you're seeing. I just don't want to lose people. Perfect. So these are things you can do to mitigate a conflict. Political realities, this includes seeking political support or educating politicians. I think right at the beginning we were talking about wolves and how finding the benefits for politicians campaigning on wolves. That is a great strategy for mitigating a political conflict. Relationship problems, these include acknowledging feelings, saying like, oh, I hear that you're frustrated, or this sounds like it's a passionate issue for you. Recognizing where they're coming from.
I think when you say that, you have to be really, really careful that you're not patronizing that person. You know, so you don't say it as a way just to get around it and try and mitigate the problem. Because if you have any, to me at least, any sense of patronizing, you're going to lose.
No, that's a very valid point. For anyone who didn't hear that, it's how do you do that without being patronizing? And that comes from being genuine. So if you are active listening, if you can show a person that you've heard what they said, that you're not countering their argument, that you want to really understand where they're coming from, that place of genuineness is hard to misinterpret. If you are doing it just to get through for the sake of the conversation so you can prove them wrong, you're right, that is patronizing. They're not going to appreciate that. Does that address your concern? Okay. But no, thank you.
We've all done that. We've all heard using I statements to say, I hear that that you think that I'm a jerk and I hate you too. And I think we've all tried to use those, like in our own relationships, you're trying to listen, but you're really saying, I feel like you're not being fair right now. And that I think is different than, I can really sense your frustration right now. What can we do here to move past this? And I think acknowledging somebody's frustration can be important, so long as you're not doing that sort of thing where you're saying, you seem really frustrated about this right now, but we're going to do it anyway. But I think it is tone, and I think that's a really important thing to be.
All right. So data conflicts can be using neutral and agreed upon experts. So instead of coming in and saying, well, this liberal newspaper says this, or this conservative newspaper says that, how do you find sources of information that are acceptable to both parties? For structural constraints, sometimes this just asks for clarifying the roles. Like, what am I doing and what are you doing? How can we make sure that I'm aware of what the decision-making process is? If you're not going to be making a decision, how can I show you that I've heard what you've said and it's going to be considered in the decision-making process? You're not going to change the structure, you're not going to change the organization, but you're going to make sure that it's not preventing progress. This might include being intentional in time or setting aside extra time, or sometimes being more efficient with your time. Everyone's been to that meeting that could have been an email? Maybe not. Yeah. Thank you. And then it's also geography. And I think this is a great example with the webinar of what you can do with modern technology to include people who aren't physically present in the room. And then finally, for value differences, I think it's important with values to stress you are not going to change someone's values, and you shouldn't be changing someone's values. So it's identifying what do you share in common. What is a value we both have? And for the Sierra Club, I suspect it's that we want the Sierra Club to succeed, or that we want this program to impact the environment. We want it to have tangible results. And then working through that shared interest that shared value into interests. So how can we then take this as our agreement, and how can we find solutions? And finally, and this is the hardest one, is agreeing to disagree. Sometimes in order to move forward, you need to say, I've heard this is your value, I understand it, and explain that you've heard, and then say, and we're not going to find an agreement, so let's move on despite that. All right, so we're going to move on to slide 6. And this is an activity where I'm going to break you out into small groups. And can we pass out the simulation front page?
Yes. And so you're going to hold on to this because we're going to use this again.
Correct. Essentially, what the context is in some different reality, Sierra Club received $10,000 to put on a very big conference for an oil and gas company, or an oil and gas policy. And you are bringing together a forum of individuals to discuss what oil and gas policies in Colorado look like in the future. This is the scenario that we're going to be playing with for the rest of the day. But as you can imagine, that would be a very charged task. It's not going to be easy to find shared values, even among the Sierra Club members. So what we're going to do is break into small groups. And if you're on the webinar, you'll be doing this individually and typing into the chat function and exploring one part of the circle of conflict to first brainstorm what are possible areas of conflict. So for example, let's say Betty Jo, Angela, David, and I are a group, and we're looking at the political realities. The political realities in our organization of putting on a conference like this might be, well, what is the appetite of this organization overall to even be engaged in oil and gas policymaking? Or what laws exist that we're not going to be changing in this election cycle? Does that make sense? Then the second task, after our quick brainstorm, we're just going to do 2 minutes, we're going to start looking at strategies. So maybe one strategy, if I think I picked the hardest one, working on politics, but maybe a strategy for politics would be working with our local elected official to see what sort of policies might be coming down the line in the legislature.
Hey, folks on the phone. This is Megan. So we're just going to have a 2-minute interactive conversation. So let me read out. There's a paper handout, which I apologize. I didn't realize we were going to have paper. So the context for this is the Colorado Oil and Gas Conservation Commission has supplied $10,000 to Sierra Club for a conference on energy, economy, and environment, a forum for nonpartisan presentations and discussions prompted by the recent passing of SB 181, which granted greater authority to communities over local oil and gas development. This statewide event has already attracted considerable interest from industry, academia, lawmakers, advocates, and environmentalists. Hundreds of people could attend if the event is done well. It is a prestigious opportunity for the Sierra Club. And then what's on your slide is the next section. So I'll read it out. The Colorado Sierra Club tasked new committee with the development of the one-day conference. And this committee is responsible for drafting the event purpose, agenda, and panel discussion topics, selecting and inviting a diverse array of speakers, one of whom is to be from Sierra Club, writing the talking points for the Sierra Club representatives on EEE, and selecting a location for the event. And so the rest of the prompt is 2 weeks after the kickoff meeting, one of the committee members asked for a Sierra Club mediator to address group dynamics. The EEE working group has struggled with effective communication. So the ask is, what would be some sources of conflict? Do folks want to type in an example from that prompt that they feel like might drive some conflict given this scenario? A little interactivity, see who's listening. I'm looking at the chat and I don't know if I see anybody chatting in. Hey, Sherry. Okay. Do we need to pick one of the conflict areas? No, or yes. I think the ask is, where would conflict be coming from? So what would be a conflict area for this prompt is definitely the ask, if that makes sense. So it's not picking one. I think we're just trying to
I think through in advance what might be driving conflict for this. Oh, so Velma, I see that you replied just to me, so I'll read it out. Different feelings about working with the funder, the Oil and Gas Commission could be a conflict. Definitely. I think I mean, just personally agree with that. The funder, where we get our money from is always, it's a question. People might question the integrity of that. The Oil and Gas Commission, people have some different thoughts on it. It's always that tension. Do you work with them? Do you try to drive change? Absolutely, Velma. That's a great example. Anyone else have any? Sherry, did you end up thinking through a conflict, area of conflict that might be applying here? Is someone trying to take over a process and not, someone trying to take over a process and not share responsibility. And Thomas, hear you. Determining the agenda would be an area of conflict. Absolutely. What's covered, what's not covered is definitely going to drive it. And then Sherry, who's responsible? The agenda would be one piece, but who's actually driving the process? And whether or not they're having an inclusive process, kind of to your point, Sherry, you said sharing responsibility. But yeah, absolutely. About, are we consensus building? Right? That's how I interpret your comment, Sherry. So you let me know if I got that right, Sherry. I think we're about to come back together, and I will share out what you guys have shared so that we're all participating in the room.
Yes, we are going to now report out to the broader group. So what I'm going to ask, and maybe I'll pick on you guys first since I'm hovering right here. Yes, all right. So could you tell us? Yeah. Could I get one of you to tell me what conflict you had, one conflict source you noticed, and then one strategy you thought of?
What are the three things?
What conflict source you had? It was data?
What you told us.
Yeah.
We had the structural organizational conflict source. Go ahead, Brad. One of the, can't think of what you called the second part. Yeah. One of the possible sources was an insufficient definition of the duties of the committee members. And we picked that one because the easy thing is to say, first possible solution is just define the duties.
No, that's perfect. Thank you. Starburst. No, I'm kidding.
So what type of strategies would you use on this type of committee to define duties and make sure that folks were okay with their duties and they were clear on their duties? So just dive into that a little bit more. What do you think? Because we're sort of talking about that with Fran's question was, how do we make sure that we all know what we're doing and we have the authority and the respect to do that? So what is the strategy?
Respect is the key. One
strategy you could use to define duties so everyone felt like they knew their role and they knew their decision-making authority and parameters.
If you've got the respect and you agree that everyone has an equal voice, then everyone can then feel free to work to their own personal advantage within the larger structure, because we identified left brain, right brain type of people, and we need both, but they need to work together equally.
So you might have a ground rule of this is a consensus-based process. Great. And you might even want to have some sort of written document where you're really writing out people's duties on the committee, whether it's membership, and sort of make sure everyone's clear on what their decision-making role is. So great. So we sometimes start with an operating protocol for different groups where we would really define out, here's the purpose of this group, here's how the decision-making process is going to look, here's our ground rules, and whether it's a recommendation or how the group is going to work together in terms of different communication. So it's super clear. Great. All right. Do you guys want to go next?
What was the question? Oh, we had value differences, and our source of
conflict one that we chose was that whether we do things incrementally or we have a total ban. And we decided to go on our strategy for how we would deal with that would be finding a common interest, or was that what it was? A common value. And in this case, it was that either strategy will ultimately reduce the impact, and which is our goal. So.
No, that's great. Using something everyone shares in common and then just building momentum right off of that. That's great. Megan, you had said that the webinar participants had some feedback.
Okay. Well, so we talked more about the sources of conflict. So to reflect the 4 sources, Velma shared different feelings about working with the funders. So especially like the Oil and Gas Commission would be a source of conflict because different opinions. There would be a lot of conflict determining the agenda from Thomas. So especially who gets to decide what's on the agenda, which really connected to Sherry's comment of not sharing what is the process, who controls that process, and is it a consensus-based process for sharing responsibility. And then last, Velma shared a source of conflict would be different styles of work and personality. So we also, I mean, we did end up chatting a little bit about the strategies, and I think it was already shared, so good news.
All right. So could I get one of you to tell me what your source of conflict was, what some sources you identified were, and strategies? Perfect. Thank you very much.
Well, one source of conflict that we thought might arise in a situation like this is that people might weigh data differently depending upon our issue was data, and so we thought that, well, one way to resolve that conflict would be to kind of basically agree that people might have different values and because of which they might value data differently, and we wanted to then come up with try and come up with a consensus on what the goal would be for this organization or for this group, and then see if we can then rearrange the weighing of the data according to the goal that we would all presumably agree upon.
So using data in very targeted ways. Okay. No, that's great. Any other comments from our data group? Thanks. All right, last group.
So 2 of the 3 things we talked about were structural. The very first one didn't sound like they established group norms, ground rules and purpose at all. They just went to, okay, let's move into conflict. Well, and in terms of fixing it, one suggestion was in-depth introduction so people would know who knew what and might do best in various things that needed to happen. We talked about, in terms of the conflict, to rise up to the common ground for everybody as a foundation. And then give them assignments, build some structure in at the beginning.
And then using that structure to get people rolling again. That's great. No, thank you. Any other comments? I know, David, I keep putting you on the spot. All right. So I think we'll move on to, are we on slide 8, 7?
Yep. So the reason we do the circle of conflict is so when you're noticing there's a conflictual, it's a cognitive approach. So when you know that there's conflict happening, it just helps you start to analyze it and step away from everyone just seems mad at everyone else to what is going on at a deeper level here. Is it a data conflict? Do people, why are we just talking across each other? Is it a relationship problem that nobody knows what their real role is? So we use this a lot when there's already conflict going on, or we might use it as sort of a risk analysis for an event or something you might be putting on. So we'll sit down, we'll look at the event, we'll look at the players, and we'll start thinking about what are the risks of putting this on and what can be some mitigation strategies. So it can be helping to prevent a future conflict, but also looking at something that's already happening and trying to really break it apart so you can address it